Our second talk for today is from Dr. Leslie-Anne Duvic-Paoli, who is a senior lecturer, associate professor in environmental law at the Dixon Poon School of Law at King's College London, and a member of its Center for Climate Law and Governance. As you can see, the title of the talk today is Legislating on Climate Change, Insights from Citizens' Assemblies, and we will proceed in the same way, around 20 minutes of talk and then 15 minutes of questions. So thank you so much for joining us today, and yeah, go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the kind invitation to come back to the Institute. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be back here today. So for my stay at the Institute, I'm going to be working on a paper that tries to bring together everything that I've been doing in the past few years, actually as a result of my fellowship at the Institute. And it all started when I applied to come and stay at the Institute in 2020 with a project on how to conceptualize questions around democracy and the energy transition. And with my partner university in Paris at Sorbonne University, it was an excellent timing because it was at the time when President Macron had created the Citizens' Assembly on climate change, Conférence, citoyens, sur le climat, and my partner invited me to join them in supporting the assembly. And so now my research and my paper at the Institute is on climate assemblies, something that wouldn't have happened without my work with my partner university here in Paris. So the starting point of this research is quite simple. It's this paradox between the fact that we are seeing an increase in climate legislation since the last 10 and 20 years. So almost every country on the planet has at least one piece of legislation that is either directly or indirectly related to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, we have a huge gap, meaning that we are nowhere to reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement, and we are very far away, despite an increasing number of policies, targets, and pledges. We are very far away from meeting the temperature targets that are set by the Paris Agreement of around 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. So I'm interested in this paradox and in how to conceptualize or reconceptualize climate legislation that is well acknowledged to be not to be ill-suited to the urgency of a challenge. At the same time, what we have been seeing in the last 5 years or so is an increase in deliberative processes when making decisions related to climate change. So this is what I called climate law's deliberative wave. So in the last 5 years also, we've seen a multiplication of citizens' assemblies on climate change being held both at the local level, so regional level, or at the level of cities that you have here on this map in red, and also at the national level that you have in this kind of green in a number of countries, in particular across Europe. So in relation to nationwide citizens' assemblies, this is mostly at the moment so far a European phenomenon, but locally we see that the phenomenon has spread more widely. So I'm interested in this deliberative wave and what it means for public participation, for democracy, and more broadly for how we make legislation and for the substance of legislation. Can we actually adopt better and more ambitious climate laws as a result of more public participation? So just for a kind of background, a climate assembly is randomly selected citizens who are selected for being representative of the broader society in terms of their age, gender, education, where they live, sometimes their opinions about climate change, etc. And so they are brought together. And they are taught about the basics of the climate problem, the kind of policies that we've had so far, and the kind of solutions that we could choose. And then they are asked to deliberate together and to make recommendations to governments on how they think, based on a consensus, how they think greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced. These assemblies have been, as I've said, held across Europe. It started in Ireland, and we've seen now I'm studying 12 other climate assemblies that have been held or are being held at the moment in Europe. Their mandate, so what they're asked to do, the questions that citizens have to deliberate upon, their design and the kind of outcome that they can have tend to vary quite significantly. But the idea behind this deliberative wave is that they might be able to offer a solution to the shortcoming of representative democracy. So we always hear that democracy is in crisis, and in particular when it comes to climate change, the short-term election cycles, the lobbying, and the difficult trade-offs that have to be made it very difficult for climate change to be governed and regulated. On the other hand, scholars of deliberative democracy argue that with these mechanisms, we can include new perspective, different types of expertise and lived expertise. We amplify the voices of people that tend to be marginalized, and there's the possibility of finding solutions that are designed for the common good instead of focusing on individual preferences. Of course, this whole system is not without its own shortcomings. So my own work is not about whether climate assemblies are good or bad, but it's about understanding the implications of this phenomenon for climate law. To give you a few examples, and so this is from the article that I wrote a few years ago when I was at the Institute, that was a comparative analysis of the first 3 climate assemblies that were held nationwide in Ireland, the United Kingdom, and France. And it gives you perhaps a little bit of an idea of how these assemblies work. In Ireland, which is a leader in terms of deliberative democracy, we've seen these citizens' assemblies being held on other topics, such as same-sex marriage, for instance, and they've had significant impact in terms of eventually adopting new laws and changing the constitution. So the topic of climate change was deliberated upon in Ireland, and the citizens made 13 proposals to cut emissions, highlighting in particular that they wanted to see Ireland become a leader in tackling climate change when Ireland is, at least in the European Union, quite a significant emitter, in particular due to its agricultural sector. Then 2 other assemblies were held almost in parallel in the United Kingdom as a result of the UK adopting a legally binding net zero target by 2050. So parliamentary select committees asked citizens' assemblies about how they would like the United Kingdom to actually reduce its emissions in order to meet this target. And in France, and those of you who have been based in France at that time will probably remember the Convention citoyenne sur le climat was quite well covered in the media, with President Macron making an unconstitutional promise that whatever would come out of the assembly would be submitted without filter to the parliament, to the executive, or to a referendum for direct adoption. Eventually, the French model of climate assemblies is so far the one that is the most ambitious because it eventually led to the adoption of a new law on climate and resilience that builds heavily, although not exactly, on the recommendations of the Citizen Assembly. So my own research project is about understanding what is the relationship between these climate assemblies, the state and law, and how to conceptualize this relationship. On the one hand, it's a mechanism that is very often mandated by the state themselves, but it's enhancing existing public participation rights and going significantly beyond public participation rights as we know them and as they are legally protected. How can citizen assembly accommodate the complexity of climate lawmaking, so including by paying due consideration to the other, to people outside of a country, and to future generations? So can they think for the common good? And how do these citizens' assemblies and their members perceive or understand and use law? For my paper at the Institute, what I'd like to do is really think about how can we conceptualize this relationship between climate assemblies and the law. As a lawyer working on this topic, I've now found myself in the last 5 years or so among a body of literature that is generally not from the legal scholarship, but is heavily dominated by political scientists and philosophers and theorists of deliberative democracy. And I've been regularly invited to join multidisciplinary projects. And so I felt that there was a need also to not only carry out with my research project, but also to think a little bit more specifically about what myself as a lawyer I'm able to actually bring to this conversation. So my point of view is that citizens' assemblies are very often lawless objects in that they are very ad hoc experiments that usually are not don't have a place in the legal framework, and so they fit quite uneasily with existing legal processes. And it's also, by looking at climate assemblies, it's also an opportunity to interrogate more broadly environmental law research. So the legal scholarship in the last 5 years or so has really been fascinated by litigation in climate change, which is of course very interesting because we've seen a rise in climate lawsuits. But I'm interested in understanding really how can we make better laws, because eventually litigation is really the last resort. It's when the initial laws were not good enough or were not clear enough that we have to resort to litigation. So I'm interested in really understanding what the relationship between these assemblies and litigation and legislation might be. Of course, writing on what the contribution of law might be and what the contribution of a specific discipline might be for an interdisciplinary journal might raise a few eyebrows, but I think that it's quite an important question to be clear about one's own contribution in terms of your own discipline, your own methods and limitations before you are able to engage with other disciplines. So for my paper, and very quickly, as I think I'm probably running out of time very quickly, but for my paper, what I'm planning on doing is, first of all, really doing a short literature review of what has been done in the last 5 years or so, because of course, when I started this project, there was very little written because it's such a new phenomenon that the literature that we have is very much on the theory of deliberative democracy, but there was, of course, very little, almost nothing on climate assembly. So I want to position my own work and what I've been doing, I was doing at the Institute and I've been doing so far in this body of work that has now proliferated, with some lawyers having a voice in that debate, but a voice that is fairly limited. I'll then be looking at the different manifestations of law in these assemblies. So in their mandate, some, for instance, the Spanish Climate Assembly was created as a result of a piece of legislation that was creating the assembly, and in terms of the outcomes, so what are the kind of pathways to legal influence of these assemblies, and these pathways tends to vary very significantly. I'll be also looking at how law is understood and seen by members of the Assembly, and it's very interesting to see that often the proposals that are made by citizens are around, at least partially, around reimagining legal concepts. So concepts such as adopting the concept of ecocide, for instance, is something that regularly comes up, rights of nature, or completely redrafting a constitution, for instance, are proposals that are very often suggested by citizens in these assemblies. And then, of course, I'll be thinking about what are the difficulties of laws in this context. Law is very territorially framed. Can we actually think about climate change in a nationwide assembly when actually climate change has a global impact? Of these citizens' assemblies, do they have the ability to integrate the concerns of future generations and of others? Is something that I'm interested in looking at. Then in my third part, I want to really make clear what the contribution of legal scholars and the legal scholarship can be to this analysis of climate assemblies, looking at different approaches and methods that might be useful to illuminate this phenomenon, ranging from a kind of doctrinal analysis that lawyers usually tend to adopt in terms of knowledge of existing frameworks that we can compare with the proposals of citizens, or understanding the legal concepts that are being put forward, but also other approaches that might also be useful in terms of comparative environmental law, social legal studies, etc. So I want to understand the kind of different methods, concepts, and approaches that law is able to give to this analysis. And finally, and perhaps a little bit ambitiously, I want to end on what are the implications of this paper for multidisciplinary research. What is the legal community able to contribute to this analysis? And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, we have some time for questions. Are there any questions, Sadi?
Leslie-Anne, I mean, this is a very important topic, not just important scientifically, but politically. But my feeling was that one reason for the creation of these assemblies is to complement what could be considered a failure of the political system to find solutions, right? So our usual way of addressing these issues is delegation through political parties and experts. And my hunch is that we suspect that these things don't work because those representatives, these structures start to work just as much for their own sake than to address the problem. And so in a way, by a random draw of citizens, we would sort of get rid of these, I mean, political sort of, you know, external aspects that are not relevant to the problem. So there are positive aspects on how to solve the problem, and I guess that's in the organization, internal organization of these things. But is it also because they're trying to safeguard from other, you know, ways of representing what the people want or how to find a solution? So I was wondering how much the political issues matter in this way of creating law.
Yeah, no. So I mean, basically, it's about identifying why governments are not doing enough, right? One of the main arguments is that they are motivated by elections, by just their short-term interest, and so just saying, well, we're going to adopt a new policy now that is going to be quite costly. People are not going to be very happy about it, but that's for the good of future generations. That doesn't get you re-elected usually. So policymakers, lawmakers just see their short-term interest. The idea is that citizens tend to think more long-term, but because they are thinking about their children, grandchildren, etc. And so they might be happier to make sacrifices, maybe pay a little bit more for something, etc., because they see the common good in a kind of long-term perspective. At the same time, there are arguments that these citizens' assemblies, they are basically created by governments just to justify the policies that they are going to take anyways, and that these citizens' assemblies can also be instrumentalized. And so that was a bit of a fear, for instance, with a carbon tax in France. Macron couldn't get his carbon tax through. He created a citizens' assembly, and then the citizens said, we don't want to talk about the carbon tax because this is so political that if we start talking about it, this is going to discredit the whole work of the assembly. So there's also something that I think we need to be careful about, the fact that these assemblies, they are created by the policymakers, and that they need to have a kind of, they have an incentive, right, for doing that. And so the ways in which the recommendations are going to be used need to be quite looked upon, because it can be quite risky.
All right. Well, thank you. And so how are you going to address this political issue in your approach?
Yes. Yeah.
No. Okay. Thanks.
Great. Next, I think it's Michael.
Hi, Leslie, and this is I'm a fellow at the Institute. I don't think we have a chance to meet yet, but really interesting talk. A couple of questions. So when you, obviously there's this whole literature on autocracy, and I'm curious if you know, how you're going to plug into that. Like you know, do you think this is a kind of climate specific set of questions, or is this just a kind of a sub application of the broader discourse around, you know, democratic decision making, and you know, what's the other one, selectocracy, or you know, the government by lottery, basically, which I think is quite interesting for what it's worth. But then my other question is, you know, I really like these ideas, and then there's like the French experience where like the law is just, so I'm curious about your assessment of the law and its you know, legitimate ability to address the climate change. As you noted, you know, carbon taxes were off the table. You know, what did we get from the law? I am not a close student of it. My quick glance was that it's a bunch of labeling, which is like, you know, whoop-de-doo. So, this goes to the kind of competence of these bodies and whether they can actually address the serious problems that we're talking about, even apart from their technical competence. And, you know, whether they kind of have that, there's the question of, are they willing to make difficult political choices? The hope would be that they would, but they might even be softer and more wishy-washy than wishy-washy politicians.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And it's great to connect. I actually teach your work in my environmental law classes. In terms of whether these assemblies, are climate specific, I think it's an important question, because I think it's, I've been talking, of course, about citizen assemblies on climate, but it's a broader deliberative wave on other topics as well. My perspective is that, of course, it's part of a bigger deliberative wave, but at the same time, the question of climate change is quite specific and quite unique when you compare it to other public policy problems that tend to be more of a yes or no answer. Are you for or against same-sex marriage? Are you for or against abortion, etc.? Of course, they are very difficult questions. They are about values and societal change, etc. But I think when we are asking citizens to make decisions on climate change, change. It's about everything in society, in the economy, in the institutions, right? So it's basically a completely different legal project, because it's not just about deciding like just something very technical and very specific. And so I think that's where it becomes quite complicated for these assemblies, because often the mandate is extremely broad, and for citizens it's also very difficult to actually understand all the challenges and the different public policy perspective options and technical options, etc. So I think now the lessons that have been learned from these kind of first experiments is to try and have a kind of narrower question, maybe around energy or food security, or so more broadly around sustainability questions, but questions that are more specific. And I think that makes it significantly more manageable. Otherwise, I think it's difficult. In terms of the results and the assessment, so of course it has been controversial in terms, first of all, of the process, because President Macron, so for French assemblies, had promised that whatever would come out of the assembly would be sent to parliament. And for citizens, they kind of understood that whatever recommendations, because they were really asked to actually draft legal proposals. It was not just we would prefer to actually have renewable energies. It's like, okay, the legal proposal has to be this. The citizens kind of understood this as, well, the parliament will just vote on the proposals and adopt them. And this is not what happened. And because it was not really actually possible constitutionally, if you send the draft to the parliament, they have to change it. But in any case, the government also then included the citizens as part of a broader dialogue with the industry and with the corporations that were affected. And so, of course, it diluted the proposals. So the proposals that eventually made it into the law, they are significantly less ambitious than what the citizens had proposed. I still find it quite interesting that eventually the outcome was a new law, because it's not what happened in other cases. In the UK, nothing really came out of the Citizen Assembly on climate change. So there's been some changes in terms of a legal framework in France, but it's not as ambitious. It's not as ambitious as it should, and it's not as ambitious as the citizens had suggested. It's, however, important, for instance, in terms of the scientific institutions. So like the Haut Conseil pour le Climat, the Scientific Committee on Climate Change, for instance, is very regularly actually making references to the proposals of the citizens and making this comparison. So I feel the proposals of the citizens have become this kind of model legal project that actually never made it into law, but that we can compare what governments are doing and what citizens would like to do. And that's quite, I think, quite interesting, because they have made it into the kind of legal imagination of what a world without the imperatives of a government would look like. At the same time, I think it's interesting to see that in citizens' assemblies, citizens rarely come up with completely drastic new proposals. They usually find a consensus on recommendations or options that were still being debated in society by scientists, etc. So they very rarely come up with something extremely new, and that's of course understandable, because they are just learning about the project. It's very difficult to come up with something completely different. So they usually use proposals that are being made by experts that talk to them, etc. They can be influenced by certain people that are kind of lobbying for their ideas, etc. But then these proposals still remain more ambitious than what governments then put in action afterwards.
Great, really interesting.
Great. And the last question from Juana.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. Quite interesting subject. And many of my questions have been already addressed, but I still have one question. I was part myself of one of those assemblies here in Switzerland as a facilitator, not as a citizen. And I was all the time thinking about the fact that the whole process was extremely complex for people, everyone. There was a very large question about climate and very complex things for understand, as you already said. But I also was all the time feeling that the whole process was extremely rational, and that a great part of the group of those 30 citizens, because here they made that with 30 citizens, would be able to maybe address a little bit better the process, or contribute in a better way to the process if other kind of possibilities were given to people, not just, you know, in a rational way, to participate in a rational way. So I was wondering if you are also looking at that. I mean, I know that is typical from deliberative democracy, but I don't know if you're interested about other ways than just, you know, make arguments and think and rationalize.
Yeah,
Because
no, I think thank you. I think it's a really important question that links back to, like, can we actually reimagine climate legislation if actually the system is already framed in a way that is quite limiting? And I agree with you that, I mean, I'm not an expert in deliberation, so I'm not looking really at whether it's possible to encourage people to think differently and how to do that. But my own perspective is that it's true. The whole system, especially it depends on the assemblies, but in France, for instance, the idea was just that it was going to be a mini parliament, right? So we are replicating the model of a democracy that doesn't actually work. That's why we're having citizens assembly, but then we're kind of replicating the same system. So citizens were working in like mini commissions, so it was not a deliberation with all the citizens, because this would have been unmanageable. So they were working in small groups. It's been shown that actually the citizens have been working almost like members of parliament in terms of how they divided the work, who were making proposals, etc. And then at the end, when they had to vote on the proposals, basically they were saying, well, we just trust the work that the other citizens have done, and so that's why we vote in favor. And they didn't necessarily engage with all the ideas because it was just too much, right? It was unmanageable. So I think this idea of new possibilities and rethinking ways of working is quite interesting. I know that there are some assemblies where they're trying to do things a little bit differently. They were also, for instance, in Scotland, they were working with a children's parliament, so also bringing the voices of children and future generations to get like new ideas. And so they had like a session with children where they said, if we buy the land back of every big landowner and we plant trees, then we can solve the problem, for instance, right? So it was ideas about, well, why can't we actually do that, right? And kind of challenging. I think children are very good at challenging what we think are truths. So I think there's been attempts at doing that. There's been also attempts at also working, I think, more with artists, for instance. So instead of having just presentations by scientists, etc., trying to also have artists join and think differently about all these challenges and this knowledge that is when you're a citizen who hasn't really thought about climate change before, and you get like all this data and these facts, it's actually you end up being quite pessimistic about like the future of your kids. So I think it's also about dealing with how people understand the news and process it, and then how they can feel empowered instead of just thinking that they cannot do anything about it. But I think, yeah, this idea of thinking about different ways of deliberating, I think, is quite an interesting one.
Yeah, sorry, just one comment. I think that maybe it would be interesting to challenge the idea that law is something that concerns highly educated people. I mean, to deliberate and to participate in a full way in that kind of assemblies, you need to be a highly educated one to understand the whole process. So underneath, my question would be interesting to challenge, or how to challenge how law is decided only by highly educated people, or you know, that, but I see what you point out, and I see the difficulties.
No, I think you have a good point. I have a few quotations actually from quite interesting quotations from citizens who said, for instance, it's quite an unusual world when we ask people who don't know anything about law to actually change the constitution and create a new law. And they've also talked about how some citizens said, even if it's a complex legal question, we don't want to put it aside. We want to engage with it, and there's like a legal team here and they can help us, and we're not like, we're going to look at everything. And other citizens who said, well, I know nothing about the constitution and this is just like too difficult for me, and that's not something that we can change. So I think within these deliberations there are very different conceptions of law and how citizens relate to law, and I think that's quite interesting in itself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this talk today. So thank you so much again, Dr. Duvic-Paoli, for joining us. And